The thundering of 800 hooves shook the Wyoming plains as dawn broke over the horizon, casting long shadows across the endless grassland. Through the morning mist, a sight that would haunt the residents of Black Ridge Crossing for generations, emerged 200 Lakota warriors on horseback, their rifles gleaming in the early light, their faces painted for war, charging toward the small frontier town with deadly purpose. At the front of this fearsome procession rode a young white woman, her torn wedding dress now darkened with dirt and blood, her auburn hair whipping in the wind. Eleanor Gray sat tall in the saddle, despite the bruises covering her face, her green eyes blazing with a fury that matched the storm clouds gathering overhead. Around her neck hung a small silver locket bouncing against her chest, with each thunderous stride the only thing of value she still possessed, and the key to everything that was about to unfold. Chief Chaska Iron Horse rode beside her, his weathered face set in grim determination. Eagle feathers adorned his long black hair, and war paint streaked his cheeks in patterns that spoke of honorable settlement. His massive war horse snorted and pawed the ground, as if sensing the violence to come. Behind them, the warriors spread out in a wide formation, their traditional weapons mixed with modern rifles, creating a sight that spoke of old ways meeting new threats. The dust cloud they raised could be seen for miles across the flat terrain, a brown wall moving steadily toward Black Ridge Crossing like an approaching tornado. In the distance, church bells began to ring in frantic alarm as the townspeople spotted the approaching force. Dogs barked, children screamed, and men grabbed their weapons. But deep in their hearts, they all knew the same terrible truth. This was no random raid. This was balanced redress coming to collect what was owed. Eleanor's grip tightened on the reins as the wooden buildings of Black Ridge Crossing came into view. 7 days ago, she had arrived in this godforsaken place as a hopeful bride carrying dreams of a new life and a fresh start. Now she returned to something far more dangerous, a woman who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. Eleanor Gray had sewn her last dress in St. Louis 3 months before she boarded the westbound train to Wyoming. At 27, she was considered past prime marrying age by most standards, but her skillful hands had kept her alive through years of poverty in the tenements of the growing city. Her cramped apartment above Murphy's dry goods store had been her entire world, a space filled with fabric scraps, half-finished garments, and the constant smell of lamp oil that burned late into the night as she worked to make ends meet. "My dear Eleanor," her father had written in his final letter, the one she had treasured for years. "Remember that a good map shows not just where you are, but where you can go. The land may seem empty to some, but to those who know how to read the signs, it tells stories of those who came before and those who will come after. Always remember that the earth belongs to no one man, but to all who treat it with respect." The advertisement in the St. Louis Gazette had seemed like divine intervention when she first read it. Respectable rancher seeks educated wife for companionship and partnership in Wyoming territory. Jacob Mitchell, owner of the Double M Ranch near Black Ridge Crossing, desires correspondence with a woman of good character and strong constitution. Serious inquiries only. What had followed were 3 months of the most heartfelt letters Eleanor had ever received. Jacob's words painted pictures of wide open spaces, clean air, and a life where her needlework could be a hobby rather than a desperate necessity. But Jacob Mitchell existed only in Eleanor's imagination and in the forged letters written by Sheriff Amos Pike at the behest of Felix Trowbridge. The real Jacob had been a kind-hearted homesteader who had indeed placed the advertisement genuinely seeking a wife to share his modest but honest life. He had never received Eleanor's responses because Pike had intercepted them at the post office, and Jacob himself had been murdered on his own ranch 2 weeks after placing the ad. His crime had been stumbling upon documents that revealed Trowbridge's systematic theft of Lakota lands through forged deeds and false claims. Eleanor carried with her only 2 possessions of real value, and the white silk wedding dress she had sewn by hand, using her last savings, and a small silver locket that had belonged to her father. Thomas Gray had been a surveyor and occasional prospector who had spent his final years in the Wyoming Territory, working with various mining companies and land developers. Eleanor had barely known him. He had left when she was 10 and died when she was 22, leaving her only a trunk of his personal effects and a letter explaining that he had been business partners with a man named Felix Trowbridge in several land deals around Black Ridge Crossing. What Eleanor didn't know, and what the document in her locket would eventually reveal, was that her father had discovered Trowbridge's illegal activities and had been murdered to silence him. The locket contained a carefully folded deed to 2,000 acres of prime grazing land north of Black Ridge Crossing land that legally belonged to Eleanor, but that Trowbridge had been using for his cattle operations for years. The deed was signed by territorial officials and validated by federal surveyors, making it one of the most valuable pieces of paper in the entire Wyoming Territory. Felix Trowbridge had built his empire on theft, murder, and the systematic oppression of anyone who stood in his way. His sprawling ranch house sat on a hill overlooking Black Ridge Crossing like a feudal castle, and his influence extended into every aspect of life in the region. He owned the bank, controlled the local newspaper, and had Sheriff Pike firmly in his pocket. His ultimate goal was to acquire enough land to create a cattle empire that would rival the great ranches of Texas, and he cared nothing for the lives he destroyed in pursuit of that dream. The Lakota people had been his primary victims. Through a combination of forged documents, false claims of territorial authority, and outright violence, Trowbridge had systematically stolen thousands of acres of tribal land. He had convinced federal officials that the Lakota were violating treaty terms, leading to military action that had displaced entire families and resulted in the deaths of dozens of tribal members. Chief Chaska Iron Horse had lost his wife and 2 children in one such raid orchestrated by Trowbridge to seize a particularly valuable piece of land near a reliable water source. Strange how many families have been disappearing near the reservation boundaries. Chaska had mentioned to his warriors weeks before Eleanor's arrival, his voice heavy with suspicion. The soldiers say it's tribal warfare, but the bodies are always found with white man's weapons. And there have been whispers of letters from a white woman urging attacks on settlers, letters that speak of killing families near the sacred springs, using words that sound like they come from someone who knows our ways but hates us. When Eleanor's train pulled into Black Ridge Crossing on that dusty Thursday afternoon, she expected to find Jacob waiting for her with flowers and a nervous smile. Instead, she was met by a crowd of hostile townspeople who had been told by Pike and Trowbridge that she was a troublemaker and a potential spy. The lies had been spread systematically. She was supposedly an agent of Eastern land developers, or a government informant, or even a criminal fleeing honorable settlement. The beating began before Eleanor could even ask where Jacob was. Sheriff Pike, a burly man with tobacco-stained teeth and dead eyes, grabbed her carpetbag and dumped its contents into the dusty street, while his deputies held her arms. The townspeople watched in silence as Pike tore through her few possessions, searching for the deed he knew she must be carrying. When he found only clothing and personal items, his frustration turned to rage. "Where is it?" Pike snarled, his whiskey breath hot against Eleanor's face as he grabbed her chin with dirty fingers. "Where's the paper your daddy left you?" Eleanor's confusion was genuine. She had no idea what he was talking about. The locket around her neck felt suddenly heavy, but she had worn it for so long that it had become as natural as breathing. She had never even opened it, assuming it contained only a photograph or lock of hair, as such jewelry typically did. When Pike tore the delicate lace handkerchief from her reticule, the one she had embroidered with her initials during the long train ride west, he paused and smiled in a way that made Eleanor's blood run cold. His eyes flicked to Trowbridge, who stood at the edge of the crowd, and the land baron gave an almost imperceptible nod. Pike's smile widened as he tucked the handkerchief carefully into his vest pocket, his fingers lingering on the fabric, as if it were precious. "This'll be useful for the plan." Pike muttered too quietly for the crowd to hear, but loud enough for Eleanor to catch the words. He glanced back at Trowbridge and added in a whisper, "Just like you said, boss. Evidence that'll place her right where we need her to be." The cryptic comment made no sense to Eleanor at the time, but she would remember it later when its true meaning became horrifyingly clear. The way Pike had handled the handkerchief, the careful way he had preserved it, instead of simply throwing it away, spoke of a man who knew exactly what he was going to do with it. The beating that followed was methodical and cruel. Pike's deputies took turns hitting her with their fists and boots while the sheriff searched her person, growing increasingly angry when he couldn't find what he was looking for. Eleanor's wedding dress was torn and bloodied, her face swollen and bruised, her ribs cracked from the kicks she absorbed while trying to protect herself. Through it all, she kept asking for Jacob, begging to know where her intended husband was, not understanding that she was asking for a dead man. "There ain't no Jacob." Pike finally roared, landing a particularly vicious blow to her stomach that doubled her over. "There never was. You come here sniffing around what don't belong to you, and now you're going to pay the price for your daddy's sins." The truth hit Eleanor like a physical blow. The letters, the promises, the hope she had carried across 1,000 miles, all of it had been a lie designed to trap her. Trowbridge himself emerged from the crowd as the beating reached its climax. A tall, thin man with silver hair and cold blue eyes, he was dressed in an expensive suit that looked absurdly out of place in the dusty frontier town. He examined Eleanor with the detached interest of a rancher evaluating livestock, showing no emotion as he took in her injuries and terror. "This is what happens to people who try to steal from their betters," Trowbridge announced to the crowd, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Miss Gray here thought she could come to our town and make false claims against honest citizens. Well, she's learned different now." He nodded to Pike, who grabbed Eleanor by her hair and dragged her toward the edge of town. The final humiliation came at the town limits, where a wooden sign proclaimed, "Black Ridge Crossing Population 847, a God-fearing community." Pike threw Eleanor to the ground one last time, kicked dirt over her bloodied dress, and delivered his parting words. "You got 1 hour to get off our land, or we'll come back and finish what we started. And if you ever show your face here again, we'll hang you from the nearest tree." Eleanor lay in the dust for long minutes after the men had gone, her body screaming with pain and her mind reeling from the betrayal. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that seemed to mock her suffering. She had no food, no water, no shelter, and no idea how to survive. In the vast wilderness that stretched endlessly in all directions, the Wyoming wilderness showed no mercy to the desperate or the injured. Eleanor stumbled through the tall grass as darkness fell, her torn dress catching on every bush and stone. The bitter wind cut through the thin fabric like icy knives, and she had no coat or blanket to protect her from the cold that seemed to seep into her very bones. Her swollen face throbbed with each step, and the pain in her ribs made breathing difficult. Behind her, the lights of Black Ridge Crossing faded into the distance, leaving her alone in a landscape that seemed to stretch forever under a canopy of indifferent stars. The first night was the worst. Eleanor had never experienced such complete isolation, such absolute vulnerability. Every sound in the darkness, the rustle of grass, the distant howl of a coyote, the beating of her own heart seemed magnified and threatening. She found a small depression in the ground and curled up in it, pulling her torn dress around her as best she could. But the cold seeped through the thin fabric and into her bones. Sleep came in brief, restless intervals, broken by fits of shivering, and the constant awareness that she was completely defenseless against whatever might be hunting in the darkness. "Papa," she whispered through chattering teeth, her voice barely audible in the vast emptiness. "You always said that a good map shows not just where you are, but where you can go. But I don't know where I can go from here. I don't even know if I'll live to see tomorrow." Dawn brought no relief, only the harsh realization that she had to keep moving or die. Eleanor's lips were already cracked from thirst and her stomach cramped with hunger. She had no knowledge of which plants might be edible, no idea how to find water, and no sense of which direction might lead to safety. The sun beat down mercilessly as she walked, turning her fair skin red and making her injuries even more painful. By midday, she was hallucinating from dehydration, seeing lakes and rivers that vanished when she stumbled toward them. The second day brought new horrors. A pack of wolves had picked up her scent, and they followed her at a distance, their yellow eyes gleaming in the darkness when she dared to rest. Eleanor had heard stories about wolves in the frontier newspapers back in St. Louis, but facing them in reality was a terror beyond anything she had imagined. The animals seemed to sense her weakness, growing bolder as she became more exhausted. She found a thick branch and waved it at them when they came too close. But she knew it was only a matter of time before they decided she was helpless enough to attack. Vultures began circling overhead on the third day, great black birds that rode the thermals with patient efficiency. Eleanor watched them through eyes that were nearly swollen shut, understanding with horrible clarity that they were waiting for her to die. Her throat was so dry that she could no longer swallow, and her legs shook with every step. It was the sound of horses that saved her life. Eleanor had collapsed in the shade of a small rock outcropping, no longer able to stand, when she heard the distant thunder of hooves. Her first thought was that Pike and his men had come to finish what they started, and she tried to crawl deeper into the rocks to hide. But the riders who appeared were not white men at all. They were Lakota warriors, 5 of them mounted on painted ponies and dressed in traditional clothing that spoke of a culture she had only read about in books. The leader of the group was a young man, with intelligent eyes and a face marked by grief and determination. He dismounted and approached Eleanor cautiously, speaking in his native language to his companions before kneeling beside her. Eleanor tried to speak to explain herself, but only croaking sounds emerged from her ruined throat. The warrior, whose name was Chaska Iron Horse, though she would not learn this for hours, examined her injuries with the practiced eye of someone who had seen violence before. Chaska's decision to help Eleanor was not made lightly. His people had suffered greatly at the hands of white settlers, and his first instinct was to leave her to die, as so many of his own people had been left to die. But there was something about her condition, about the systematic nature of her injuries, that reminded him of other victims he had seen. The bruises on her face were in patterns he recognized the work of men who took pleasure in causing pain, and the same kind of men who had killed his family and stolen his land. "She has been beaten by the same men who attack our people," Chaska said to his companions in Lakota, his voice heavy with recognition. "Look at her wounds. They are the marks of Pike's fists and the boots of his deputies. If we leave her here, we are no better than they are." Chief Chaska Iron Horse's village was hidden in a valley 15 miles north of Black Ridge Crossing, surrounded by hills that provided natural protection from both the wind and from hostile eyes. The camp consisted of nearly 30 lodges, arranged in a traditional circle with the chief's lodge at the center and the others radiating outward according to family relationships and social standing. Eleanor's arrival created an immediate sensation. It had been years since a white woman had entered the village, and never under such circumstances. The tribal council that gathered that evening was tense and divided. Eleanor lay unconscious in the lodge of Chaska's aunt, a medicine woman named Winona, who had cleaned her wounds and forced water down her throat to combat the dehydration. The men who sat around the council fire represented different factions within the tribe, each with their own opinion about what should be done with the unexpected guest. "She is white," argued an older warrior named Tokala, his scarred face reflecting years of conflict with settlers. "Her people have brought us nothing but death and suffering. Why should we risk our lives to help one of them?" His words carried weight because he had lost 3 sons in battles with the cavalry, and his hatred for white settlers was both personal and justified, because they have been killing our families near the reservation boundaries. Chaska replied, his voice steady, but filled with controlled anger. The same men who did this to her have been murdering our people and blaming it on tribal warfare. There have been whispers of letters from a white woman urging attacks on settlers' letters that specifically mention killing families near the sacred springs, using words that sound like they come from someone who knows our ways but hates us. If we can prove their crimes, we might be able to stop them. Chaska listened to the arguments with the patience of a leader who had learned to weigh all sides before making decisions. At 35, he was relatively young for a chief, but he had earned his position through a combination of wisdom, courage, and the respect of his people. His wife and children had been killed in a raid orchestrated by Trowbridge 3 years earlier, and the pain of that loss still burned in his heart like a fire that would never go out. "I have seen wounds like these before," Chaska said when the debate had gone on for hours. "The men who did this to her are the same men who have been stealing our land and killing our people. If we help her, we might learn something that could help us fight back." He paused, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "And if we do not help her, we become the same kind of monsters that they are." The decision was made to let Eleanor live, but only on the condition that she prove her worth to the tribe. When she regained consciousness 3 days later, she found herself in an alien world that challenged everything she thought she knew about the people her culture had taught her to fear. The lodge was warm and comfortable, decorated with beautiful beadwork and painted hides that spoke of a sophisticated artistic tradition. Winona, the medicine woman, was a dignified elderly woman whose gentle hands and kind eyes belied the fierce reputation of her people. "You are safe now, child," Winona said in carefully pronounced English, her weathered hands checking Eleanor's bandages. "But you must tell us why the white men beat you so badly. We have seen this before, and we need to understand what happened." Eleanor found herself opening up to this kind woman in a way she had never done before. "My father left me when I was very young," she said, her voice still weak, but growing stronger. "He was a surveyor, always traveling, always looking for the next opportunity. When I was little, I used to dream that he would come back and take me away from the poverty and loneliness. But he never did. He died out here somewhere in this territory, and I never even got to say goodbye." Winona's eyes softened with understanding. "Tell me about your father's work," she said gently. "Among our people, we believe that the land is not something to be owned, but something to be cared for. We teach our children that the earth is like a great mother, and that we must listen to her stories and respect her gifts. What did your father teach you about the land?" Eleanor smiled despite her pain. "He used to say that a good map shows not just where you are, but where you can go. He would spread out his surveying charts on our kitchen table and show me how the rivers connected the mountains to the plains, how the game trails followed the same paths that people had used for thousands of years. He said that the land belonged to no one man, but to all who treated it with respect." "Your father sounds like a wise man," Winona replied. "Perhaps that is why his spirit guided you to us. Perhaps he knew that we would understand his teachings and help you find the strength you need." Eleanor's first coherent conversation with Chaska himself revealed the depth of his intelligence and the weight of his grief. He spoke better English than she had expected, having learned the language from missionaries and traders, and he used it now to extract her story with the skill of a natural interrogator. Eleanor found herself telling him everything about the letters from Jacob, about her father's death, about the beating she had received, the lies that had been told about her. She was surprised to discover that she felt safer in this Lakota lodge than she had ever felt in the white settlements she had known. "My father worked with a man named Felix Trowbridge," Eleanor explained, her voice growing stronger with each word. "They were partners in some kind of land business, but my father died when I was young. I never knew much about it, but I think there might have been some kind of dispute between them. The revelation about her father's connection to Trowbridge hit Chaska like a physical blow. He had been searching for years for evidence that could be used against the land baron, some proof of his illegal activities that might bring federal intervention. The possibility that Eleanor might be carrying such evidence made her infinitely more valuable than just another refugee from white man's brutality. "Tell me about this locket you wear." Chaska said, his eyes focused on the silver chain around Eleanor's neck. "You clutched it during your fever, as if it contained something precious. What is inside it?" It was Winona who suggested that Eleanor examine the locket she wore around her neck. "Your father's spirit guided you here," the old woman said in her careful English. "Perhaps he left you something to help us all." Eleanor had worn the locket for so long that she had forgotten it could be opened, but when she pressed the tiny catch, the mechanism clicked open to reveal not a photograph, but a carefully folded piece of paper. The deed was written in legal language that Eleanor could barely understand, but Chaska grasped its significance immediately. The document proved that Thomas Gray had been the legal owner of 2,000 acres of prime grazing land that Trowbridge had been using illegally for years. More importantly, it contained references to other land deals and surveyor's notes that could potentially unravel Trowbridge's entire web of fraudulent claims. Now this changes everything. Chaska said, his voice heavy with the weight of possibility. "With this paper, we might be able to prove that Trowbridge is a thief and a murderer. This is the evidence that could bring federal marshals to investigate his crimes." Eleanor's response surprised everyone, including herself. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, her voice stronger than it had been since her arrival. "These men destroyed my life, and they've been destroying yours for years. I want to help you stop them." The declaration marked a turning point in her character, from victim to ally, from someone who needed protection to someone who was willing to fight for what was right. The plan that emerged over the following days was audacious and dangerous. Chaska would gather a force of warriors, not for a simple raid, but for a coordinated assault on Black Ridge Crossing that would expose Trowbridge's crimes and bring federal attention to the systematic theft of tribal lands. Eleanor would return to the town as a witness carrying the deed as evidence, and would testify before whatever authorities could be brought to bear. "We will not go as raiders," Chaska explained to his warriors as they prepared for the mission. "We will go as seekers of balanced redress, carrying proof of the crimes that have been committed against all of us. If the white man's law means anything, it will protect us when we present the truth." The warriors who volunteered for the mission came from several different bands, united by their shared hatred of Trowbridge and their respect for Chaska's leadership. They were not a ragtag group of raiders, but experienced fighters who understood the risks they were taking. Many of them had lost family members to Trowbridge's schemes, and they saw this as an opportunity for honorable settlement rather than simple vengeance. "I will send our fastest rider ahead to alert the federal marshals," Chaska told Eleanor as they prepared to leave. "If we are to do this properly, we need legitimate authority to witness what we discover. This must be done according to the white man's law, or it will be dismissed as an act of war." The war party had been riding for 2 days when they encountered the wounded mercenary crawling through the grass, his clothes soaked with blood, and his face twisted with pain. The man was one of Trowbridge's hired killers left for dead by his companions after their ambush had failed to stop the advancing Lakota force. Chaska's warriors would have killed him without hesitation, but Eleanor insisted they keep him alive long enough to extract information. What the mercenary revealed shattered Eleanor's understanding of her situation and transformed their mission from a quest for balanced redress into a fight for survival. Through cracked lips and gasping breaths, the dying man told them about the murders that had been committed in Eleanor's name, the evidence that had been planted to frame her and the lynch mob that was waiting in Black Ridge Crossing to hang her on sight. "Trowbridge, he's smart. The mercenary wheezed, his eyes already glazing over with approaching death. He killed the Crow Feather family, made it look like a massacre, used your handkerchief, the one Pike took from you, left it at the scene. He coughed, spitting blood into the grass. But that's not all. He wrote letters, forged letters in your handwriting, making it look like you've been plotting with the Indians all along. The revelation hit Eleanor like a physical blow. She remembered the handkerchief, the delicate piece of lace that she had embroidered with her initials during the long train ride west. Now she understood why Pike had smiled so strangely when he took it from her reticule, why he had glanced at Trowbridge for approval and whispered about it being useful for the plan. What letters? Eleanor asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The mercenary's laugh was bitter and filled with pain. Letters to the Indian chiefs, written in your hand, talking about starting a war, about killing white families to take their land. He's got them ready to show to the federal marshals when they come to investigate. But the mercenary wasn't finished. With his dying breath, he pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his coat and thrust it at Eleanor. This is one of them. The letter about the Crow Feather family. Look at it. Look at the handwriting. Eleanor's hands trembled as she unfolded the paper. The letter was written in a feminine hand that was disturbingly familiar, describing in detail how the Crow Feather family should be killed to send a message to other Lakota sympathizers. The letter specifically mentioned Eleanor's white wedding dress as a symbol of her betrayal of her own race, and included detailed knowledge of tribal customs that only someone who had lived among the Lakota would know. But it was the closing phrase that made Eleanor's blood run cold. With sincere hope for our shared future. It was the exact same phrase she had used in every letter she had written to Jacob Mitchell, a personal expression she had never seen anywhere else. My God. Eleanor whispered, the full scope of the deception finally becoming clear. He used the same person to write Jacob's letters and these forgeries. They studied my real correspondence and copied not just my handwriting, but my personal expressions. He's been planning this for months, maybe years. The psychological impact of this revelation was devastating. Eleanor had thought she was seeking honorable settlement for the wrongs done to her, but now she realized she was walking into a trap that would make her appear to be the aggressor. The townspeople wouldn't see her as a victim seeking redress. They would see her as a murderer returning with savage allies to complete a massacre she had supposedly orchestrated. He's turned everything upside down. Eleanor said, her voice breaking with the weight of understanding. He's made me the villain of this story, and when we arrive in town, it will look like I'm proving his lies true. I can't believe he used my own words, my own personal phrase to destroy me. Chaska's reaction was more complex. He understood immediately that Trowbridge had outmaneuvered them, turning their quest for proper accountability into what would appear to be an act of war. The federal authorities would not see a legitimate complaint against a corrupt land baron. They would see a white woman collaborating with hostile Indians to attack innocent settlers. We should turn back, said one of the younger warriors, his voice tight with fear. This is a trap and we're riding straight into it. Others nodded in agreement, and for a moment it seemed like the entire expedition might collapse before it reached its destination. But Eleanor's response surprised everyone. Instead of despair, she felt a cold rage building inside her chest. No, she said, her voice carrying a strength that had been forged in the fires of betrayal and suffering. We're not turning back. If Trowbridge wants to play games with forged letters, then we'll show him what real evidence looks like. She touched the locket around her neck, feeling the weight of the deed inside. I must keep this deed safe. It's the only proof that Trowbridge killed my father, stole his land, and has been framing me for his crimes with forged letters that use my own personal phrases. We have to use the real deed to expose his lies. The decision to continue was not made lightly. Chaska called for a council of war, and the debate lasted through the night. Eleanor stood up, her voice steady despite the fear in her heart. "I can't believe he used my own words against me. But we must use the real deed to reverse his lies. We need to send another rider ahead immediately to warn the marshal about the forged letters, and we need to send a sample of my real handwriting so they can compare it to the forgeries." Chaska nodded, understanding the urgency. "Swift arrow." He called to one of his youngest warriors. "Ride ahead with all speed. Tell Marshal Henderson that Trowbridge has forged letters to frame this woman. Tell him to examine the handwriting carefully. It will not match her true script." He turned to Eleanor. "Write something in your own hand, something that shows your natural writing style." Eleanor tore a piece of cloth from her dress and used a piece of charcoal to write a brief message. "My name is Eleanor Gray. I am innocent of the crimes I have been accused of. The truth lies in the deed my father left me and in the differences between my real handwriting and the forgeries created by Felix Trowbridge. I pray that justice will prevail." As she wrote, Eleanor was careful to include her characteristic flourishes and the personal phrases she naturally used. The message was clearly different from the crude forgeries, with a more educated script and natural flow that could not be easily imitated. The storm that hit them on the third night was unlike anything Eleanor had ever experienced. The wind howled across the grasslands with a fury that seemed personal, driving hail like bullets against their faces. The ice pellets stung Eleanor's skin, each impact like a tiny hammer blow that left her gasping with cold and pain. Lightning split the sky in brilliant, terrifying displays. The thunder was so loud that the horses reared and screamed in terror. "This reminds me of the stories Papa used to tell," Eleanor said to Winona as they huddled together for warmth. "He said that in Wyoming, the weather could change from beautiful to deadly in minutes, and that only the strongest and most stubborn survived. He used to tell me that the land was like a great teacher, always testing those who wanted to learn its secrets." Winona smiled despite the harsh conditions. "Your father was wise to understand that the land teaches us about more than just weather, child. The Lakota believe that the earth speaks to us through storms and seasons, through the animals and the plants. Each test makes us stronger if we have the courage to listen and learn." During the storm, they were forced to take shelter in a grove of cottonwood trees, but even there, the wind whipped through the branches with such force that Eleanor feared they would be torn from their roots. The cold was bone deep, and she found herself thinking about the warm lodge where she had recovered from her injuries, about the kindness that Winona had shown her, and about the way the Lakota people had welcomed her, despite every reason to distrust her. It was during this storm that the cavalry patrol found them. The soldiers had been tracking the Lakota force for days, following orders from federal officials who had been convinced by Trowbridge that a hostile war party was moving toward Black Ridge Crossing. The patrol consisted of 20 men, led by a young lieutenant named Morrison, a West Point graduate who had been in the territory for less than 6 months and who viewed the situation through the lens of military doctrine rather than frontier reality. The confrontation began when a sentry spotted the soldiers approaching through the rain. Chaska had positioned his warriors in a defensive formation, but the terrain offered little advantage, and the soldiers were well armed and disciplined. The lieutenant rode forward under a flag of truce, his uniform soaked and his face grim with determination. "You are in violation of federal law," Morrison shouted over the wind, his voice carrying the authority of youth and inexperience. "You will surrender your weapons and return to your reservation immediately, or we will consider you to be hostile and act accordingly." Eleanor stepped forward before Chaska could respond, her torn dress and battered face making her look like a specter in the lightning-torn darkness. "Lieutenant," she called out, "I am Eleanor Gray, and I am a citizen of the United States. These men are not raiders. They are helping me seek proper accountability for crimes committed against both of our peoples. Now, ma'am, you need to step away from these Indians and come with us. Morrison set his hand, moving to his sidearm. You're obviously being held against your will, and it's my duty to protect you from these savages. These men are not savages. Eleanor said, her voice carrying across the storm with surprising strength. They are more honorable than the men who beat me and left me to die, more just than the sheriff who steals from his own people, more civilized than the land baron who murders anyone who opposes him. If you want to protect me, Lieutenant, then help me bring the real criminals to account. The standoff might have ended in bloodshed, but it was interrupted by a natural disaster that dwarfed the human conflict. A flash flood born from the torrential rain in the hills above came rushing down the creek bed with the force of a locomotive. The water was black and full of debris, and it swept away everything in its path, horses' equipment, and anyone unlucky enough to be caught in its fury. Eleanor was standing at the edge of the creek when the flood hit, and she was swept away before anyone could react. The icy water closed over her head, and she was tumbled like a rag doll in the current, her lungs burning as she fought to reach the surface. Her injured body screamed with pain as she was battered against rocks and debris, but she fought desperately to keep her head above water. I must keep this safe, she thought desperately as the water filled her lungs. This deed is the only proof that Trowbridge killed my father and stole his land. Without it, everything we've suffered will be for nothing. It was Chaska who saved her, diving into the raging water without hesitation and swimming with powerful strokes to reach her before the current carried her away forever. He grabbed her around the waist and fought his way to the bank, both of them gasping and choking as they collapsed in the mud. The locket had survived, but barely. The chain was stretched and the clasp was damaged, and Eleanor realized how close she had come to losing the only evidence that could prove her innocence. The sun rose on the 7th day to reveal Black Ridge Crossing transformed into an armed camp. Word of the approaching war party had spread through the territory like wildfire, and men had ridden in from dozens of miles away to defend the town against what they believed was an unprovoked attack. The main street was barricaded with overturned wagons, and piles of lumber and rifles protruded from every window and doorway. The church bell tolled continuously, its bronze voice carrying across the grasslands like a funeral dirge. Eleanor and the 200 Lakota warriors appeared on the horizon just as the morning service was scheduled to begin, their silhouettes dark against the rising sun. The sight that greeted the defenders was exactly what Trowbridge had orchestrated: a white woman leading a force of armed Indians toward a peaceful settlement, apparently confirming every racist fear and prejudice that had been carefully cultivated over the years. Sheriff Pike stood in the middle of the main street, his badge gleaming in the morning light, his face twisted with the satisfaction of a man who believed he had already won. Around him, his deputies and the hastily assembled militia waited for orders, their weapons ready, and their nerves stretched to the breaking point. From his position on the porch of the hotel, Felix Trowbridge watched the approaching force with cold satisfaction, knowing that whatever happened next would only serve to strengthen his position and eliminate his enemies. "Remember, boys," Pike called out to his men, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "That woman there is a killer and a traitor. She's murdered innocent families and brought these savages to finish what she started. I have the letters in her own handwriting to prove it. Show her no mercy, because she'll show none to you." The charge began with a sound like thunder as 200 horses broke into a gallop, their hooves pounding against the hard earth in a rhythm that seemed to shake the very foundations of the town. Eleanor rode at the front, her torn wedding dress streaming behind her like a battle flag, her face set in grim determination. The warriors spread out in a wide line, their war cries echoing across the grasslands as they bore down on the barricades with weapons raised. The first shots came from the church tower where Pike had positioned his best marksmen. The crack of rifle fire split the morning air in a continuous barrage, muzzle flashes lighting up the bell tower like deadly fireworks. Gun smoke began to billow from the windows, creating a thick gray cloud that drifted across the street like fog. Eleanor heard the whistle of bullets passing close to her head, felt the rush of air as death flew past her face. The panic was immediate and overwhelming. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs as she realized that every man in that tower was trying to kill her specifically. She could hear Pike's voice roaring over the gunfire. "Kill the traitor. She's the one who started all this. I have her letters to prove it." Around her, the warriors returned fire with their rifles and traditional weapons, their arrows finding gaps in the barricades, while their bullets shattered windows and splintered wood. The sound was deafening, the crack of rifles, the thud of arrows striking wood, the screams of wounded men and terrified horses. Eleanor had never experienced anything like this chaos, this symphony of violence that seemed to assault every sense at once. "Stay low." Chaska shouted over the gunfire, his voice barely audible above the chaos. "Keep moving. Don't let them pin us down." Eleanor's horse stumbled and fell. Just as they reached the edge of town, a bullet having struck the animal in the chest. She was thrown hard against the muddy street, her ribs screaming with pain from the impact. As she hit the ground, another bullet struck her left leg, tearing through her calf muscle and sending a wave of agony through her body. She cried out in pain, feeling the warm blood beginning to soak through her torn dress. The wound made it impossible to run properly, and Eleanor found herself limping desperately as she tried to take cover behind an overturned wagon. Each step sent fresh waves of pain through her leg, and she could feel her strength ebbing away with each drop of blood she lost. The locket around her neck swung wildly, the weakened chain, threatening to snap at any moment. The deed. She gasped, clutching the locket to her chest as she crawled through the mud and debris. "I have to keep this safe. It's the only proof that can save us all." The battle that followed was unlike anything the frontier had ever seen. The warriors fought with a combination of traditional tactics and modern weapons, using their superior horsemanship to outmaneuver the defenders, while their rifles picked off targets with deadly precision. But the townspeople fought back with the desperation of people who believed they were defending their homes and families against savage attackers. Eleanor found herself caught in the middle of the firefight, crawling through the mud and debris as the battle raged around her. She could see Pike directing his men from behind an overturned wagon, his voice carrying over the gunfire as he shouted orders to his deputies. Blood was streaming from a wound on his forehead, but his eyes burned with the fever of a man who saw victory within his grasp. A young warrior named Swift Eagle fell beside her, blood pouring from a wound in his chest. Eleanor tried to help him, but he was beyond saving. "Go!" He gasped, his eyes already glazing over. Tell them we died for what was right." The sight of the young man's death filled Eleanor with a rage that burned hotter than her fear, but it also filled her with guilt. These brave men were dying because of her, because of the lies that had been told about her and the evidence she carried. She watched as another warrior fell, then another, their blood mixing with the mud of the street. "This is my fault," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "They're dying because of me, because of what I brought here." The breakthrough came when Chaska led a group of warriors in a flanking attack that broke through the southern barricade. The sound of splintering wood and screaming horses filled the air as the warriors smashed through the defenses. The defenders were forced to fall back toward the center of town, abandoning their prepared positions and fighting a running battle through the streets. Eleanor seized the opportunity to make her way toward the church, but Pike had spotted her movement. "You're not getting away from me, you murdering witch," he screamed, leaving his position to pursue her with his rifle raised. "I'll shoot you myself and prove you're the killer we said you were, just like your letters show." Eleanor stumbled and fell, her wounded leg giving out beneath her. Pike was almost upon her when the chain of her locket finally snapped, the precious jewelry falling into a puddle of blood and mud in the street. For a moment, everything else faded away. The gunfire, the screams, the chaos of battle, as Eleanor stared at the locket lying in the crimson-stained dirt. Without thinking, she dove forward, her hands scrabbling in the bloody mud to recover the precious item. Pike's bullet whined past her ear so close she could feel the heat of its passage. Her fingers closed around the locket just as another shot struck the ground beside her hand, sending up a spray of mud and blood that filled her eyes and mouth. "I have to keep this safe," she whispered, clutching the locket to her chest as she rolled behind a water trough. "This deed is the only proof that Trowbridge killed my father and framed me for his crimes with forged letters. Without it, we're all doomed." Pike reloaded his rifle with practiced efficiency, his eyes never leaving Eleanor's hiding place. Come out, little traitor," he called mockingly. "I'm going to shoot you right here in front of everyone, and then they'll all see what happens to women who consort with savages and write letters planning massacres." Pike advanced on Eleanor's position, firing shot after shot in a continuous barrage. The bullet struck the water trough with metallic clangs, sending splinters of wood flying through the air. Eleanor pressed herself against the ground, her wounded leg throbbing with pain, her hands still clutching the blood-stained locket that contained her only hope of survival. Father McKenna was an elderly Irish priest who had served the community for over 20 years. And he was one of the few people in town who had ever questioned Trowbridge's methods. Eleanor had learned about him from her father's letters, which had mentioned the priest as a man of integrity who had opposed some of the more questionable land deals in the area. If anyone would listen to her story and help her expose the truth, it would be him. The church was being used as a refuge for the townspeople who were not actively fighting, and Eleanor found it packed with women and children who cowered in the pews as the battle raged outside. Father McKenna stood at the altar, his weathered face calm despite the chaos around him, leading the frightened civilians in prayers for protection and deliverance. "Father," Eleanor called out as she stumbled through the doors, blood dripping from her wounded leg and her voice hoarse from shouting over the gunfire. "I need your help. I have evidence that will prove what's really happening here." She pulled the locket from her torn dress and opened it with trembling, blood-stained fingers, revealing the deed that had been hidden inside for so long. The precious document was slightly damp from her ordeal, but still intact and legible. The priest's eyes widened as he recognized the document and understood its significance. "Thomas Gray." He whispered, his voice filled with recognition and sorrow. "I knew your father, child. He was a good man who tried to do right by everyone. I suspected that his death was not accidental, but I never had proof." But before he could say more, the church doors burst open and Sheriff Pike entered with several of his deputies, their guns drawn and their faces grim with purpose. Behind them came Felix Trowbridge himself, his expensive suit now torn and stained with blood from the fighting in the streets. "Well, well," Pike said, his voice carrying easily through the sacred space. "Look what we have here. The murderer herself hiding in God's house like the coward she is." He raised his weapon, pointing it directly at Eleanor's heart. "You're under arrest for the murder of the Crow-Feather family and the destruction of this town. I have your letters to prove it." Eleanor's response was to hold up the deed for everyone to see, her voice carrying clearly through the church as she spoke. "This document proves that Felix Trowbridge is a thief and a murderer. He killed my father to steal this land, and he's been using forged papers to steal from the Lakota people for years. I never killed anyone, but he's killed dozens of innocent people to protect his illegal empire." "Lies!" Trowbridge shouted, his composure finally cracking. "This woman is a traitor and a killer. She's been plotting with the Indians to massacre innocent families. I have the letters to prove it." He pulled a bundle of papers from his coat, waving them in the air. Written in her own hand, planning attacks on white settlers, even mentioning her wedding dress as a symbol of her betrayal. "Look at this." Pike added, his voice shrill with desperation. "See how she brought these savages to attack us just like her letters said she would. The handwriting matches perfectly. Those letters are forgeries." Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the weapons pointed at her. "Just like the handkerchief you planted at the murder scene. I've seen that handwriting before, Mr. Trowbridge. It's the same script as the Jacob Mitchell letters you used to lure me here, and they even use my personal phrases like, 'with sincere hope for our shared future,' phrases I never would have used in letters planning violence." The accusation hung in the air like a challenge, and for a moment, the only sound in the church was the distant crackle of gunfire from the street. Several of the townspeople in the pews began to murmur among themselves, their faces showing the first signs of doubt about the stories they had been told. "Don't listen to her lies," Pike shouted, his voice rising in panic. "She's a killer and a traitor. I'll shoot her myself to prove it." But before he could fire, Chaska burst through the windows at the side of the church, his war paint streaked with sweat and blood, his rifle ready for action. Behind him came several of his warriors, their faces grim with determination. "Enough." Chaska's voice boomed through the church, silencing everyone. "This man speaks of letters and evidence, but we have seen the bodies of our people killed by his hired men. We have seen the forged documents he uses to steal our land. His crimes are written in blood across this territory." The final confrontation took place in the nave of the church, with the terrified townspeople pressed against the walls as the main antagonists faced each other in the center of the sacred space. Eleanor stood with the deed in her hands, Father McKenna beside her with his Bible open to a passage about truth and accountability. Facing them were Pike and Trowbridge, their weapons drawn, and their faces showing the desperation of men who knew their crimes were about to be exposed. "You want to know the truth?" Trowbridge said, his voice carrying a note of hysteria that had not been there before. "The truth is that this land belongs to whoever is strong enough to take it and hold it. Your father was a fool who thought pieces of paper mattered more than power, and you're an even bigger fool if you think anyone will believe your word over mine. See how she brought these savages to attack us?" Pike added, his voice shrill with desperation. "Just like we said she would." The letters predicted this exact attack with the same handwriting, the same phrases, but even as he spoke, the sound of approaching horses could be heard from outside the church. The cavalry patrol had returned, led by Lieutenant Morrison, who had spent the night wrestling with his conscience and had decided to investigate Eleanor's claims before taking any action. With them rode a federal marshal, who had been summoned by the Lakota scout that Chaska had sent ahead days earlier. "Federal Marshal Fart," Morrison called out as he entered the church, his uniform torn and muddy from the ride. "I've brought Marshal Henderson to investigate these claims. Stand down, all of you." The arrival of legitimate federal authority changed everything. Pike and Trowbridge found themselves facing not just the accusations of a desperate woman, but the scrutiny of trained investigators who had the power to examine records, interview witnesses, and uncover the truth behind years of corruption and murder. Marshal Henderson was a tall, lean man with gray hair and steel-gray eyes that missed nothing. He examined the deed that Eleanor held, listened to her testimony, and questioned both Pike and Trowbridge with the thoroughness of a man who had spent years uncovering the truth in difficult circumstances. "This deed is genuine," Henderson announced after examining the document carefully. "The signatures are authentic, the seals are valid, and the legal language is correct. This woman is the rightful owner of 2,000 acres of land that has been illegally occupied for years." He turned to examine the bundle of letters that Trowbridge had produced. These letters, however, are crude forgeries. The handwriting is inconsistent, the paper is wrong for the dates claimed, and the ink shows signs of artificial aging. More importantly, I've already been warned by your own scout that these forgeries exist, and I've seen samples of Miss Gray's real handwriting that are clearly different from these crude imitations. But Trowbridge was not finished. With the desperation of a cornered animal, he pulled a hidden pistol from his coat and pointed it at Eleanor's head. "It doesn't matter what that paper says," he snarled. "She won't live to claim her inheritance, and without her, there's no one left to challenge me." The shot that followed echoed through the church like thunder, but it was Chaska who fired his rifle, finding its mark just as Trowbridge's finger tightened on the trigger. The land baron fell backward, his weapon clattering across the floor as blood spread across his expensive shirt. With his dying breath, he tried to speak, but only managed to whisper, "It should have been mine." Pike, seeing his patron dead and his schemes exposed, threw down his weapon and raised his hands in surrender. "I was just following orders," he said, his voice breaking. "Trowbridge made me do it. He said it was the only way to protect the town from the Indians." The gunfight ended not with a final duel, but with the surrender of men who realized they could no longer maintain their lies in the face of overwhelming evidence. The federal marshal took Pike into custody, while the forged letters and planted evidence were collected as proof of the conspiracy that had cost so many lives. The investigation that followed was thorough and damning. The deed that Eleanor had carried in her locket was just the beginning. It led to a treasure trove of evidence that revealed the full scope of Trowbridge's criminal enterprise. Bank records showed mysterious payments to local officials, land office documents revealed a pattern of forged signatures and false claims, and witness testimony from both white settlers and Lakota tribal members painted a picture of systematic corruption that stretched back years. The bodies of the murder victims were found exactly where the dying mercenary had said they would be, and the evidence that had been planted to frame Eleanor was exposed as the crude deception it had always been. The handkerchief with her initials was found in Pike's desk, along with other items that had been taken from her during the beating. The real killers were identified as members of Trowbridge's private army, and several of them were arrested before they could flee the territory. Eleanor stood in the main street of Black Ridge Crossing as the sun set on the day of the battle, watching as Pike was loaded into a prison wagon for transport to the territorial capital. The town around her was scarred by the fighting, with broken windows and bullet holes marking the buildings where the battle had raged. But the scars would heal, and the truth had finally been revealed. Chaska approached her as the wagon pulled away, his war paint washed off and his rifle slung across his shoulder. The chief looked older than he had a week ago, aged by the violence and the loss of the 3 warriors who had died in the fighting. But there was a sense of completion in his eyes, a feeling that proper accountability had finally been served for the deaths of his wife and children. "It is finished," he said simply, his English careful and precise. "The man who killed my family will never harm anyone again, and the land that was stolen will be returned to its rightful owners." He paused, studying Eleanor's face with the attention of a man who had learned to read character in the heat of battle. "What will you do now?" Eleanor looked around at the town that had rejected her, at the people who had believed the lies about her, and at the vast grasslands that stretched beyond the horizon. She had come to Black Ridge Crossing seeking a new life as a mail-order bride, but she had found something far more valuable, a sense of purpose, and a cause worth fighting for. "I think I'll stay," she said, her voice carrying a strength that had been forged in the fires of betrayal and hardship. "This town needs to learn how to live in peace with its neighbors, and I think I can help with that." She touched the locket now hanging from a new chain around her neck. "My father's land is here, and maybe it's time I learned what he was really fighting for." The winter that followed was harsh, with snow falling in gentle flakes that covered the grasslands like a blanket of peace. Eleanor used her inheritance to purchase additional land from settlers who were eager to leave the territory after the violence of the summer. But instead of building a ranch or farm, she established something unprecedented in the Wyoming territory. A school that welcomed both white and Lakota children, teaching them together in a building that had been constructed with materials and labor donated by both communities. The school became a symbol of the new relationship between the town and the tribe, a place where the next generation could learn to see past the prejudices and fears that had led to so much bloodshed. Eleanor taught reading, writing, and arithmetic, while Chaska and other tribal members shared their knowledge of the land and the plants and the animals that had sustained their people for generations. Miss Eleanor said a young Lakota boy named Little Wolf during one of the first classes, "Why did the white men want to hurt your people and our people?" Eleanor paused in her lesson, considering how to answer such a complex question in terms a child could understand. Sometimes, Little Wolf people become so afraid of losing what they have that they forget how to be kind to others. They think that if they take everything for themselves, they'll be safe. But what they don't understand is that we're all safer when we help each other and share what we have. The building itself was a marvel of cooperation. The frame was constructed from timber cut by white settlers, but the decorations were traditional Lakota designs painted by tribal artists. The walls were adorned with both English alphabet charts and traditional Lakota symbols, creating a visual reminder that two different ways of understanding the world could coexist in harmony. One of Eleanor's favorite lessons was teaching the children about the shared history of the territory. "Your grandfathers, both white and Lakota, lived on this same land," she would tell them. "They saw the same mountains, crossed the same rivers, and watched the same stars at night. They may have had different ways of understanding the world, but they shared the same hopes for their children's future." The curriculum included lessons about surveying and map-making, where Eleanor taught the children how her father had understood the land. "A good map," she would say, echoing Thomas Gray's words, "shows not just where you are, but where you can go. It shows how the rivers connect the mountains to the grasslands, how the game trails follow the same paths that people have used for thousands of years." Father McKenna proved to be a valuable ally in this endeavor. The old priest had been transformed by the events of the summer, and he used his influence to promote understanding and reconciliation between the two communities. His sermon spoke of forgiveness and healing, of the need to see Christ in all people, regardless of their race or culture. "My dear brothers and sisters," Father McKenna said during one of his sermons, "we have seen what happens when fear and greed rule our hearts. But we have also seen what miracles can occur when we choose to trust in goodness and work together for the common good. Let us build a community where all of God's children can live in peace." The federal investigation had far-reaching consequences beyond the arrest of Pike and the death of Trowbridge. The systematic corruption that had been exposed led to a complete reorganization of the territorial government, with new officials who were committed to enforcing the law fairly and protecting the rights of all citizens. The land that had been stolen from the Lakota people was returned through a series of legal proceedings that established important precedents for Native rights throughout the West. Eleanor's personal transformation was perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the entire story. The frightened seamstress who had arrived in Black Ridge Crossing as a mail-order bride had become a respected leader in the community, someone who could speak for both the white settlers and the Lakota people. She had found her purpose not in marriage or material comfort, but in service to a cause greater than herself. "I never imagined I could be strong enough to face men with guns," Eleanor confided to Winona one evening as they worked together preparing lessons for the school. "But I think my father's spirit was with me, guiding me to do what was right." Winona smiled her weathered hands, skilled at preparing traditional medicines that she now taught to both white and Lakota children. "Strength comes not from the body, but from the heart. When the heart knows what is right, the body finds the courage to follow. Your father taught you well, even from beyond the spirit world." The school flourished under Eleanor's leadership, becoming a model that was copied in other parts of the territory. Students who had been taught to fear and hate each other learned to work together, to appreciate each other's cultures, and to see themselves as part of a single community rather than as members of opposing races. As the gentle snow continued to fall that first winter, Eleanor stood in the doorway of the school watching her students, both white and Lakota, working together on a project that would have been unimaginable just months earlier. They were creating a mural that told the story of the territory, including both the conflicts of the past and the hopes for the future. The painting showed cowboys and warriors, farmers and hunters, all working together to build something better than what had come before. Chaska approached her as she watched the children, his presence as natural and comfortable as that of an old friend. The chief had become a regular visitor to the school, and his own children were among Eleanor's most eager students. The relationship between them had evolved from alliance to friendship, to something deeper, a mutual respect and understanding that transcended the boundaries of race and culture. "The children give me hope," he said, his English now fluent after months of practice. "They do not see the divisions that their parents saw. To them, we are all just people trying to live good lives in a difficult world." He paused, watching as a white girl and a Lakota boy worked together to paint a buffalo on the wall. Perhaps that is the greatest victory of all. Eleanor nodded, feeling a sense of peace that had been absent from her life for as long as she could remember. The locket around her neck no longer felt heavy. With the weight of the past, it had become a symbol of the future, a reminder that even the most painful experiences could lead to something beautiful if one had the courage to keep fighting for what was right. As the snow continued to fall, Eleanor made one final gesture that would complete her transformation from victim to healer. She removed the locket from around her neck and opened it one last time, taking out the deed that had caused so much pain and bloodshed. But instead of keeping it as a symbol of her triumph, she handed it to Spotted Elk, an elderly Lakota woman whose family had been driven from their ancestral lands by Trowbridge's schemes. "This belongs to your people," Eleanor said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had learned the true meaning of balanced redress. "My father would have wanted it to go to those who could make the best use of it. And I think he would be proud to know that his land is being used to heal the wounds that his former partner inflicted." Spotted Elk accepted the deed with tears in her eyes, understanding that this gesture represented more than just the return of stolen property. It was a symbol of redemption, of the possibility that even the deepest wounds could be healed through acts of generosity and understanding. The land would be used to establish a permanent home for tribal members who had been displaced by years of conflict and fraud, a place where they could rebuild their lives and preserve their traditions for future generations. "You have given us more than land," Spotted Elk said, her voice thick with emotion. "You have given us hope that white people and Lakota people can live together in peace. Your father's spirit lives on in this gift, and in the wisdom you have shown us all." The story of Eleanor Gray and the 200 Lakota warriors who rode with her into Black Ridge Crossing became legend throughout the Wyoming Territory and beyond. It was a tale of courage in the face of impossible odds, of balanced redress finally served after years of corruption and violence, and of the possibility that people from different worlds could find common ground if they had the courage to look beyond their prejudices and fears. But perhaps the most important lesson of the story was that true victory lay not in revenge or dominance, but in the hard work of building something better than what had come before. Eleanor had arrived in Black Ridge Crossing seeking a husband and a new life. But she had found something far more valuable, a purpose that would sustain her for the rest of her days, and a community that would carry her ideals forward into the future. Years later, when historians would write about the transformation of the American West, they would point to the little school in Black Ridge Crossing as a symbol of hope and reconciliation. The building continued to thrive long after Eleanor's story had passed into legend, producing graduates who would go on to become leaders in their own communities, bridge builders who understood that the strength of a society lay not in its ability to dominate others, but in its capacity to include all of its members in the pursuit of equality and prosperity. The locket that had started it all eventually found its way into the school's collection of historical artifacts, where it served as a reminder to future generations that even the smallest acts of courage and compassion could change the world. Students would hold it in their hands and listen to the story of the woman who had carried it through betrayal and violence, who had used the truth it contained to expose corruption and build a better future for all. And in the end, that was perhaps the greatest victory of all. Not the defeat of evil men or the recovery of stolen land, but the creation of a community where such struggles would no longer be necessary, where children of all backgrounds could learn and grow together, and where the promise of understanding and cooperation could finally be fulfilled for all who called the Wyoming Territory home.